Добрый вечер, Лариса Юрьевна.
Добрый вечер. Что-то никого нет пока, да?
Да, вот подключается уже, но я пока звук уберу и камеру.
И я тоже. Мгм.
Добрый вечер.
Добрый день, друзья. Скажите, меня видно, слышно?
Видно и слышно. Добрый вечер.
Добрый вечер, Лариса.
Добрый вечер.
Hi, Joel. Today we are going to have our discussion maybe till about 8:20, 8:30 Moscow time. Is it okay with you?
Say that again.
Today we are going to have our discussions till 8:20 or 8:30 according to
Okay,
Is it okay with you?
that's fine. Yeah. I need to get my speaker up.
Okay. Друзья, я думаю, мы собрались. Пора уже. Значит, это ввожу на экран нашу диглотту. В прошлый раз мы начали было разбирать стихи 42-43 и поговорили про много разных интересных вещей. Например, про то, как именно соотносится осел с мельничным жерновом. Вот, говорили про синтаксис 41 стиха. У нас осталось нерешенным самое главное, может быть, проблема стиха 42, по крайней мере, кто такие гой микрой в этом стихе. И в этот захватывающий момент нашего разбора 42 стиха мы расстались о том, что Джоэль обещал рассказать нам в следующий раз, кто такие гой микрой, привлекая, в частности, последующие стихи 43, 47. Это действительно очень интересное. Мы сейчас, наверное, встретимся с контроверзией о том, что здесь имеется в виду. I just said in Russian that last time we stopped at the most important point, or the verses that we discussing last time. We discussed a lot of different things, but not the main thing. Who are those homikroi that shouldn't be scandalized or offended? And your last word during our last meeting was that you would offer a suggestion, a hypothesis. The next time has come, so it's up to you to suggest what is your opinion about who those homikroi are. Meanwhile, I looked at your commentary, at Adela's commentary, and I saw that this is really a very controversial item, probably one of the most controversial items in exegesis of this chapter, as well.
Yeah, I don't remember promising that I would solve this problem, but I guess so. What are our possibilities? I mean, it's the little ones who believe in Jesus, presumably. So does that, I guess from what I recall, the two main possibilities are that these are Christians in general, as you know, the small ones in this world, as you mentioned last time,
Mhm.
little flock, or maybe it is children who believe in Jesus. I guess I think that's less likely. Though, of course, you know, the idea of somehow offending children, doing something bad to children, is that's somehow more offensive than doing something bad to adults. But maybe you could remind me of what the controversies are about.
Yes, this is exactly two different interpretations. Either the Christians as such are called homikroi, little ones, because of their lack of hubris, and we can probably look at a list of passages where Christians are called weak ones, Astenes, or poor ones. Less often we can see that the adjective mikros is applied, like the little flock, and so on. This is one line of interpretation. The other line of interpretation is that homikro here are actual children.
Yeah.
And since that the Taskandala, which I mentioned here, are some kind of offense with regard to children.
And in chapter 10, you are going to have, a scene where actual children are brought to Jesus to bless. And the disciples initially resist that. And Jesus says, "Let the children come to me." So that will be actual children, though, again, the question is, what is this action of blessing them symbolic of? Is it only of Jesus' attitude towards actual children, or do the children again stand for something else? But I mean, they are in verse 42. It is ton mikron tuton ton pisteu on ton. I guess there's question about the ace eme, but still they are. It's not. They don't seem to be just children, but children who are qualified by their belief. But I don't think we don't really have much from the earliest Christian literature about the whole question of children being part of the Christian community. We, as I mentioned last time, in Acts, when people are baptized, they're baptized with their house. So that presumably includes wife, children, even possibly slaves. But mostly in the Gospels and in Acts, the people who interact with Jesus are adults. And it was, kind of a radical movement in some tension with society. You have the saying of Jesus about leaving your father and mother and to follow Jesus. So there are some, I would say, anti-family connotations in early Christianity. So I don't know. It's and you start to have discussion of this whole issue of children, and is baptism only for believers in the 2nd century and on? But we don't really have much evidence about it from the first several centuries, I don't think. I mean, the other thing is that, as the passage proceeds, there's all this talk about, if your hand offends you, cut it off. And if your foot offends you, and some people see sexual implications in that. And so that might have some back influence on what's being talked about in verse 42. Is it some sort of sexual abuse of children that is being discussed there?
Yes, this is exactly what I saw in Adela's commentary. But I really wonder whether the emergence of this line of interpretation in modern scholarship has something to do with particular series of scandals in modern sense for the word scandal that were especially in the Catholic Church for the 20th century, because let me turn to Adela's commentary. It seems that, wait a second. It seems that in the exegesis that Adela is suggesting, there is even no doubt, since actual. Do you see the page?
Yes.
Adela's commentary. Since actual children are the subject of verses 33, 37, it's likely that these little ones who trust in me are actual children as well. Little one is first and foremost a synonym of paideia. I'm not sure this is true with regard to the New Testament. And then the idea is that in the Markan context, giving offense scandalizo to one of them probably means relating to a child in a sexual manner. This hypothesis is supported by the likelihood that verses 43, 45, and 47 also refer to sexual temptations. In my when I'm lecturing to my students, I often tell them that in many cases, particular exegesis or particular perspective, a scholar assumes with regard to the text her comment upon, this perspective is predetermined by his own context. I mean,
Yes,
the scholar context.
I certainly think that's true. I guess another possibility, though, is people, in previous decades, didn't want to talk about stuff like sexual abuse of children, and so um, you know it either wouldn't have occurred to them, or if it did occur to the exegetes, they would have suppressed it. So, and I do think that there's times when our own horizon uh, il- is it is similar to the horizon that was there in the first century. So, just seeing the way things work out in our world can heuristically give us ideas about, the way these texts connect with each other. So, I mean, for example, in some of my work, I've looked at modern Jewish apocalyptic movements and messianic movements like the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Maybe we've talked about this before. And so, that does reflect something that's going on in the modern world, or studying other messianic and millenarian movements. But uh, they they may show you things about what was happening, or things that may have been happening by analogy in the first century. So I don't think the fact that an exegesis reflects modern concerns is necessarily um, a strike against it, though I think we always have to be cautious about retrojecting our own concerns and feelings and opinions onto earlier centuries.
Yes. So what is your position? Because there are two completely different lines of interpretation. Either small children, and probably scandal is referring to sexual abuse, or this is a term referring to Jesus' disciples as such. And in this case, it means something completely different from sexual abuse of children.
I don't know. What do I say in my commentary? That must be right. Um,
Okay.
maybe I say I don't know. um, I mean, definitely children are in view, I would say, right? Well, maybe I can't say definitely, because if it's just one of the little ones, I mean, it is mikron rather than teknia. Even though if it was teknia, Jesus also uses that in the Gospel of John, at least, for his disciples. I mean, in the previous verse, he is talking about ordinary acts of hospitality performed for Jesus' disciples. So I guess the real question is, he's definitely talking about the disciples and the way people relate to them in the previous verses. Is there then a transition in verse 42 into another subject? And does talking about possibly Christian children enable that transition to take place? But I can see that it may very well, on the contrary, be about verse 42 could be about the disciples as symbolized by children. But then you would have to figure out what's being spoken of in verses 43 to 48. I mean, the organization here is very loose, and it's by scholars like to use the word catchword. It's like, for example, at the end of the passage, all of a sudden you get this stuff about salt. What does salt have to do with anything? And the other gospels, like in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about salt, but the context makes it clear what he's talking about. You are the salt of the earth. He's clearly taking that as an image for the disciples. But here in verses 49 to 50, it just seems to be bringing together various proverbs about salt, which may not have, even verse 49 may not have had anything to do with verse 50, because verse 49 in context, there the salting seems to be a reference to judgment. Everybody will be salted with fire. like the fire will be sprinkled on them like you would salt. But then verse 50, salt is good. And so have salt in yourselves. I mean, so even those two verses, they're using the same image, but they seem to be going off in opposite directions. So then it's possible, I would say, that that there's a similar rough transition between verse 41 and verse 42. So I think that would probably be an argument for Adela's position.
Yes, that's true. But on the other hand, I see something. Okay. On the other hand, I think that at least some loose connection between different verses here may be. And of course, the composition of the gospel does not look as a completely chaotic. When we spoke about Jesus' prediction of his suffering, we mentioned that every time Jesus' prediction of his suffering is contrasted with disciples' inability to understand this, and moreover, often contrasted with the disciples striving for being great, sitting on the right hand of Jesus, quarreling about who is most important, and that's what is the context.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, this is a big question, I would say, in gospel studies, and especially maybe about Mark, though also I can think of similar discussions, say, about John, is to what extent is the author using sources, that already were put together, and to what extent is he, whatever sources he has, is he editing them together in an artistic way? So some people describe Mark as a conservative redactor, who's got, all this stuff that has come down to him, some of it in preformed collections, some of it maybe as individual sayings, and his own contribution has not been that radical. Whereas others would see him as very creative and a very artistic weaver together of whatever material he has. And I'm sure, there's similar questions about Old Testament sources and, their use. So I'm just signaling that it's a bigger question about how creative, how artistic, how much in control of their material gospel writers were.
Okay, and what would be your position in this much more general discussion? You're one of the best specialists on Mark, so it's up to you to tell us after you have set this choice before us between understanding of Mark as a simple collector and see Mark as a creative writer. What would be your choice between these two alternatives?
I mean, I think I avoid extreme positions, so I certainly think Mark had sources, and sometimes you can see from the, just from the literary awkwardness of sources coming together that he does have pre-existent material. And I do think, however, that there's some sort of artistic and theological mind that is shaping this material. And so I don't think he's totally in control of the material, but I also think he has exercised some theological and artistic shaping. So I usually I avoid the extremes. And I go for it may be what we call a cop-out, but I don't take an extreme position on this. So.
Okay, but if we concentrate on this particular motive of Jesus going to Jerusalem, Jesus Christ predicting his own fate, and disciples' inability to understand this. Do you think this is something, Mark? Do you think it's more probable that this is something Mark inherited from previous tradition, or do you think this is something more probably created by Mark in his narrative?
Well, I think it probably is something that he inherited from his tradition, but it seems to be a consistent, repeated emphasis in his gospel. So I would think that it was important to him. And, so I guess that's maybe how you avoid the circularity of the argument is you look at the overall shaping of the gospel. What seem to be the most important themes? And certainly the lack of perception of the disciples is a major theme here, stronger than I would say in any other gospel. And the other synoptic gospels have both toned it down. And also, I guess in general, it seems to me that this section of the gospel, this whole section, it starts with the healing of a blind man in 8:22 to 26. It ends with the healing of a blind man, 10:46 to 52. That is right next to that is the story about Jesus saying, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter saying, "You're the Messiah." Jesus predicting his suffering and death. Peter saying, "No." Jesus rebuking Peter for not seeing. So you have a preoccupation with seeing, and you have a lot of instruction of the disciples in this section. So I think that seems to me to be a deliberate shaping. He's deliberately placed this whole section between two stories of the healing of blind men. And in between, there's these disciples who often seem to be, they're sort of like the first guy who's healed. They see, but they don't see. And so I think there's a connection being made between the lack of perception of the disciples and these framing stories. So that seems to me like pretty sophisticated shaping of the material. So I don't know, maybe I go more towards the sophisticated shaping, but this leads some people to think that Mark has created this whole gospel and that it's all just a sophisticated fiction, and that I don't think.
Okay. One of the most interesting things is that you state that in Mark's gospel, the incapability of the disciples to understand Jesus is more prominent than in other gospels. Can we say that in other gospels where we have this topic, it's just an echo of Mark?
Well, yeah, I'd say that, so sometimes Matthew and Luke retain it, but reframe it. For example, the passage we were just talking about, Jesus saying, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter saying the Messiah, but then Peter rebuking Jesus, Jesus rebuking Peter. So Matthew retains that, but he also has when Peter's something that you don't have in Mark, when Peter says you are the Christ, he has the Son of the living God. And then Jesus praises him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." So that makes the criticism of Peter, which then does follow, it's not as harsh because you also had this great praise which you don't have in Mark. Um, so, and I think I could cite other examples in Luke where he lessens the lack of perception of the disciples. However, I'd say in John too, in John also, which I don't think that John read Mark, but he also has a pretty profound theme of incomprehension, both of the enemies of Jesus, but also at some point of the disciples of Jesus. So I I think that's in both cases it's saying something about early Christian perceptions of discipleship. The disciples, they are people whose eyes have been opened in some way, but just realistically, they also get a lot of things wrong. And I guess that's part of the reason I respond theologically to Mark's portrait, because I think it's true to life, true to Christian life. Whereas it seems to me that Matthew and Luke lend themselves more to a sort of Christian triumphalism, which can be kind of dangerous.
Yes, that's exactly why this topic is so interesting and important for me. As far as I understand your position, we may say that that Matthew and Luke, they just retained this topic of disciples being unable to understand Jesus from Mark, and in both cases, in case of Matthew and in case of Luke, they tried somehow to make it less striking, less prominent. So if it were not for the Gospel of John, we could have say that most probably it was Mark who invented this topic, and Matthew and Luke just inherited it and retained it. But since we have something parallel in John, we cannot completely put all the burden of inventing this topic on Mark.
Well,
Exactly.
yeah, and I guess I think there's something analogous in Paul. Paul also can talk about Christians as those whose eyes have been opened and so on. But, he also has a passage like Romans 7, which I think well, I'm not sure what it's talking about, but it may be talking about Christian existence. And it talks about Christian existence as a divided existence where you want to do one thing, but you have other things that prevent you from doing it. So and I guess I'd relate that to, well, especially since I see Mark as a Pauline theology, I'd relate that to the dividedness of the disciple. I don't think neither are they entirely blind. They do see something and they at least follow Jesus, and Jesus says he's going to have a rendezvous with them after the end of the gospel. So it's not like I think they're totally cast off, but they do have a lot of problems. And I think it is true that Matthew and Luke, sometimes they retain that, but sometimes they lessen it.
What
Oh.
particular passage of Romans 7 do you have in mind?
I mean, well, so for example, in verse 15, I don't understand my own actions,
Mhm.
so I mean, it isn't mostly about epistemology, which I think, in Mark it is about epistemology. But certainly, Paul castigates the Corinthians for not seeing certain things, and the Galatians. So Christian perception, it's not like Christians have entered into an age where they understand everything. He's always at war with people who don't accept his particular view of things. But I mean, the connection with Romans 7 is a little bit loose, but all I'm saying is that the picture there is of somebody who's divided against himself.
But in any case, Paul criticizes the same apostles, especially in Galatians. So this may also have been the background for early Christian tradition.
Well, yeah. Well, especially Peter. Yeah. That's right.
Okay. Going back to our text, just so that if we still see some kind of a connection within chapter 9, within the second half of chapter 9, then we have one of these scenes on the road. Jesus predicts his own passion, while his disciples are quarreling, discussing tis maidson,
Mhm.
and then the discussion is about the necessity to be humble. No,
Yeah.
if you want to be protos, must be eschatos, panton diakonos, and after this, we see kalabon paidion, estres and auto. Of course, one can say that this is just Mark takes two different pieces of material and puts it one after another without any connection. But I think that probably this image of paidion, Micron paidion, is a deliberate opposition to this quarrel about tis maidzon.
Yeah, I think that's a good argument.
Yes, and though in fact maidzon and megas, that's the same adjective, though in different forms, and
Mhm.
Mikros is the opposite. So I would rather think that this hoi mikroi here
Yeah.
are somehow connected with this megaloi.
Yeah. I
Made
think you're right about that. Yeah. I withdraw my support for Adela. Yeah. But then I guess then my remaining question is, then what does this have to do with what follows in verses 43 to 48, if anything?
it's a good question. How do you think about what is here the thread that connects these different sayings together?
See, again, you know, the thread that connects it on a superficial level is the word skandalidze, right? Which occurs in verse 42. And then also occurs in verse 43 and throughout the rest of the passage. But I don't know what, you know, your hand offending you, and your foot offending you, and your eye offending you. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. And, you know, how that relates specifically to Christian existence rather than, you know, than general just existence in the world. You know, don't do anything bad with your hands and your foot or your eye. Whereas, you know, I think you could see just through the collection of those references to various organs and limbs, a sexual interpretation. You know, and various people argue that, you know, foot can refer to the male sexual organ, and cite the book of Ruth, you know, where she's supposed to go in and do something with whatever is her prospective husband's feet or foot. I forget if it was singular or plural.
Yes, and of course.
Yeah, Boaz, right?
Yes,
And certainly, you know, like verse 47 about your eye offending you. I mean, I think this is interpreted elsewhere in the tradition, this sort of language as, well, at least Jesus speaks of in the Sermon on the Mount again about, you know, you've committed adultery if you look at a woman with lustful thoughts. So that language sort of lines up possibly with some sort of sexual offense. So maybe there's a transition between one sort of scandal in verse 42 dealing with Christians in general, and then in verses 43 to 48 specifically something about sexual sins.
yes, it's an interesting question. Do you want to say something more about verses 44, no, 41 and 42 before we proceed to next pericope?
No, I think we've solved that.
Окей. Друзья, есть ли у нас еще какие-то мысли, предложения по поводу того, что мы обсуждали? Тогда говорили про стихи 41, 42, и вот про нашу дискуссию о том, что здесь означает этот образ гой-микрой.
I wonder what Maria wants to say about the passage from Job that she's put in the chat.
Yeah, it's just I don't know, maybe maybe it was discussed by commentators and scholars, but it's just one passage I found which has these three entities: a feet, a foot, a hand, and then an eye, in the context of of scene,
Yeah.
of like describing my scenes.
Yeah. And it doesn't specify what sort of sin it is, really.
Yeah, without just like I don't know, sort of merism, or just like any kind of offensive actions.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be sexual. I mean, because, like, okay, so what's the hand? The hand is what you do things with. The foot is what makes you go to something, and the eye is, what you. I mean, it's like you could say there's a progression here. You see something, and you want it, and so you go towards it. You use your feet, and then you do something with your hand. So that. I mean, on a general level, that's what those three images connote.
Yeah, but as you see in Job, it's in different order. First, my feet have strayed me, then my heart follows my eyes, probably with some sort of desire, sinful desire, and then a stain on my hands.
Yeah. No, that's a good parallel, I think.
Друзья, правильно я понял, что мы со стихами 41, 42 решили временно, по крайней мере, расстаться? Маша, у вас нету по поводу 41, 42 каких-то мыслей или замечаний?
About 41, 42, actually, I had the same idea as Michael told about that this hoi mikroi can be sort of echo to Maidzon before, and maybe it's like something like comparative construction without any preposition or conjunction. So one of those who are like the small ones. So it's like a metaphor.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah, but probably.
You two, you have both convinced me. If I didn't say that,
but if it is sort of metaphor or comparative image, I think all these implications about children can also work here as a part of this larger metaphor.
Хорошо, друзья, тогда, раз мы все равно перешли к следующим стихам уже, давайте тогда их прочтем. Оля, вы с нами?
Да, я тоже.
Давайте мы вас попросим тогда прочесть стихи 43-47.
Kai Ian скандализит Апокупсу, Аутен Колон Истинсе Килон Isviktein Eisten Дзоен, Entos Duo Heres Echonta, Apeltein Eisten Vienna, Eistupur To Asbestum, Кай 45, подождите, 44-го нету, получается? Какая-то лакуна.
Да. У нас здесь в стандартных изданиях докритических они следовали за рукописями, которые повторяли 48 стих после 43 и 45. То есть у нас стихи 44 и 46 рукописей византийских просто-напросто равнялись стиху 48. Вот. Но впоследствии критические издания опирающиеся на более ранние рукописи, пришли к выводу о том, что появление вот этого тройного повтора, где червь, пожирающий их, не мрет, и огонь не погаснет, это уже более позднее развитие, а изначально только один раз этот червь появлялся в самом-самом конце. Поэтому в критических изданиях у нас 44 и 46 стихи пустые.
Мгм. Ну да, тогда 45-й. Kai ean hopussus skandalitzese apokopsinauton. Kolonistinse iseltein isten zo en holon etus do podes echonta. Bletene isten giena. Гиена. Так.
Да. Спасибо. И 47-й вы прочли, правильно я понимаю?
Нет, 44-й, 43-й, 45-й.
Давайте еще и 47-й. Они настолько однотипны, что, конечно же, их стоит рассматривать вместе.
Да, Kai ean ho офтальмос su skandalitzese ekpele auton. Колонсе эстен монофталмон исэлты эстен басилеен тутыу эдуо офтальмус эхонта блатынай эстен гейн.
Спасибо. Если рука твоя тебя увлекает в грех, отруби. Лучше тебе безруким войти в жизнь, чем с двумя руками в гиенну, в огонь угасающий. Если твоя нога тебя вовлекает в грех, отруби. Лучше тебе безногим войти в жизнь, чем с двумя ногами быть брошенным в гиенну. Если твой глаз тебя вовлекает в грех, вырви его. Лучше тебе одноглазым войти в Царство Божие, чем с двумя глазами быть брошенным в гиенну. Ну, 3 стиха здесь действительно очень построены по одной и той же модели. И опять же здесь мы сталкиваемся с двумя разными линиями интерпретации. Метафорической, что речь идет об отсечении разнообразных соблазнов, которые на самых разных жизненных поприщах могут встретиться вот ученику Христову, одному из тех малых сих, о которых говорит эта перикопа. Одна интерпретация, и другая интерпретация сексуальная, что здесь и рука, и нога, и соблазны глаза так или иначе связаны с какими-то сексуальными соблазнами. В первом приближении кажется, что сексуальная интерпретация все-таки натянута. Мы уже видели, что в предшествующем стихе тоже прилагалось как-то дело связывать этот скандалон этих вой-микрой и с детьми, и с сексуальным абьюзом, мне кажется, маловероятным. И здесь тоже казалось бы, что это как-то натянуто, если бы не довольно-таки удивительная параллель в одном из талмудических трактатов. I say that there are two interpretations here. One understands all the sins mentioned here in a more general way, because every sinful action starts with looking, then involves some sinful way, metaphor of foot, and some sinful action, metaphor of hand. And on the other hand, we have a more narrow sexual understanding of these 3 verses. And I said that I would have treated this sexual interpretation as very artificial, If it were not for the passage that you quote in your commentary, a parallel from Talmud Bavli. Let's look at this parallel.
Good old Talmud Bavli comes to my rescue. No.
Yes. Wait a second. Okay. Do you see this?
Yes.
This is Chichi's Nida 13b, part 11. Nida 13a and Nida 13b, both dafs of this Chichi's are somehow devoted to the topic of masturbation. What Rabbi Trafon is saying. Anyone who inserts his hand below his navel, his hand should be severed. Then the rabbis have some objections, and then finally Rabbi Trafon said to them, it's preferable that his belly be split open, because one of the objections was that if his hand is severed while his hand is on the level of his belly, the belly also will be split open. And Rabbi Trafon said it's preferable that his belly be split open and the hand severed, but he shouldn't descend into the pit of destruction. The parallel is really striking.
Yeah. I presume that this is a ruling that was never carried out in practice.
Yes, I think that most rulings of the Talmud were never carried out in practice.
Yeah, they like to think about possibilities.
Yes. Yes. Amar Lahon, Pova, Tibaka, Kriso, Ali Red, Lib'er Shahat. Though we have here Be'er Shahat and not Gehinom, but still the image is the same. In fact, in later Jewish exegesis, this Be'er Shahat and Gehinom are almost synonyms.
I'm very sorry. Actually, I haven't looked into Job. What's going next after that? It looks like it's actually both this Talmud place and our place in Mark are references to Job, because right after that, this another passage goes about adultery and about
Маша, это Иов, какая глава, какой стих?
глава 31, с 7 стиха по 12, заканчивается тем же самым. Тоже испепеляющим огнем.
Да.
Похоже, что это очень правдоподобно. Я была не права.
If my feet have wandered from the rightful path, or if my eyes have led my heart astray, or if my hands are smirched with any stain, then let me sow and others eat, and let me uproot it on the earth. If my heart has been seduced by a woman, if I have lurked at my neighbor's door,
Okay.
Маша, а где у нас здесь этим появляется огонь?
Сейчас я пришлю и английский перевод. Да, вот английский перевод. Okay, so verses 7 and 8, 7 about feet, heart, eyes, and hands,
Yes.
and then verse 10 about verse 9 about wife of my neighbor, and then verse 12 is punishment, fire burning down to Abaddon.
Yeah. Yeah, that's significant.
So there is no reason to separate them and to understand verse 7 as something not connected with following.
It's somewhat
Okay.
ironic to bring Job in to illuminate this passage in Mark, because so often in Job you can't understand what's going on either, but this seems to be pretty clear. I mean, don't people think that Job is like really, I mean, it's very difficult often to interpret it.
Okay, let's look at Hebrew and Greek Job 39:7. Маша, да?
Mhm.
Exactly έχω πούσμου εκ του οδού.
But
Like
I'm not saying that this passage is difficult to interpret, because I mean, it does seem to be clearly talking about adultery, and with a similar set of images to what we see in Mark.
Yes. Purgar estin kaiomenon, epi panton ton meron. Utan epelte.
Are you trying to, there's nothing, are you showing it on the screen? Because we're not seeing it.
Oh, sorry. Yes. That's especially combination of Job 31 verses 7. If my step has turned aside from the way, and my heart has followed my eyes, and if any spot has clung to my hands, and then for that would be a fire consuming down to Abaddon. This image of Abaddon may be both the prototype for Topur and Blatene Eastern Genan that we have in Mark. Blatene Eastern Genan. Hopotopur was Benutai. And this may also looks like the origin of the Rabbi Tarfon's saying, if Ali read Lib Er Shachat, Lib Er Shachat. Маша, правильно я понимаю вашу мысль, что вот что вот эти стихи Иова могли дать начало некой такой то ли риторической формулировки, которая независимым образом отразилась у Марка и позднее в трактате Нида.
Ну да, моя идея примерно такая, да, что это ну, действительно, какая-то такая риторическая фигура развернутая, способ в такой литературе мудрости говорить, премудрости говорить о грехе, прелюбодеянии и, соответственно, э, наказании за него или вот еще отдельно есть места, где просто отдельно прелюбодеяние сравнивается с огнем.
Мгм.
Вот, ну, наверное, это менее релевантно здесь. Хотя, может быть, тоже это важно.
I see that I do mention the Job passage in my commentary. So, but
You mentioned,
I
okay.
probably should have made more out of it. It is a striking parallel.
On what page, Joel?
691.
691, okay.
And I say that the same, I claim there that this double entendre of foot for penis may be present in the Job passage, I claim. It's under foot,
Mhm.
lower
Okay.
down on the page. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then I do say at the end of the paragraph, but as Job illustrates, the more usual and direct connection of foot is with walking. So even though in the early part of the note, I'm presenting the evidence for this, specific euphemism for the penis, then I say at the end, but foot usually just means foot, and it means what you walk with. It's like,
Yeah.
like Freud said, sometimes a pipe is just a pipe.
Yes, exactly. And I would agree with you, and I would even agree with Freud as concerns the passage you quoted, not as concerns other pieces of his heritage.
Mhm.
But as far as I understand Maria, and as far as I understand Job 39:7, Job 39:7, 31:7.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Job 31:7 is not about any kind of sexual sin, but a more general idea. If my steps have turned from the path of righteousness, whatever is meant, if my heart has been led by my eyes, there's no specification of no sexual overtones. If my hands have been defiled in Hebrew, вкопи давак meum. Once again, this does not necessarily have any sexual connotations. Then there's a small. There are two lines. This.
I'm sorry, may I add to your analysis, but I think actually verse 8, it speaks in favor the hypothesis that sexual connotations are actually implied here, because this idea that this phrase about another reaping what I have sown, it should be, and about offspring who would be rooted out, it should be about sleeping with another man's wife.
Сейчас, Маша, мне кажется, что 31.8, насколько я могу понимать русский текст, опять же, не несет в себе никаких специфических сексуальных именно коннотаций.
Я не уверена в этом. Я думаю, что это очень может быть, что здесь имеется в виду это.
I think that's a good point. But then also in verse 13, you have a more general thing about, if you've done anything wrong to your servants, to your slaves.
Yes.
But in the next verse, I have woman. I think verse 8 should be understood in this with this particular adultery.
Сейчас, Маша, простите. Допустим, что Эзра А может иметь в виду как сев в прямом смысле слова, вот он какой-то урожай посеял и надеется, что возойдет, потому что это, естественно, такая сельскохозяйственная культура, сельскохозяйственный мир, где главным богатством является поле, урожай, вот, а то, что там у него выросло на этом поле, кто-то съест еще. Вот, и то, что он посеял, будет выдернуто с корнем. Если я правильно понимаю, вы думаете, что здесь имеется в виду скорее зачатие детей, окей. Я думаю, что Эзра А может в таком смысле вполне пониматься, но не совсем понятно, что это означало бы, что кто-то съест его детей, нет? Что значит Ахер Йохель?
Ну, мне кажется, что это метафорика такая. Мне не кажется, что это прям буквально он это говорит и имеется в виду вот ровно в этих словах. Мне кажется, что это такой метафорический язык. Вот, но вот это вот, как она, господи, сейчас, простите, я забыл, как это слово звучит в 8 стихе. Цеца.
Маша, сейчас видно 8 стих на экране?
Слово цеца у Иова не единожды именно как потомки, как дети встречается. И вообще вот эта идея, что мне кажется, что сама эта идея появляется в других местах тоже. Не знаю, я думаю, что это...
Sorry, go finish, yeah.
Yeah, I already finished, sorry.
How about verse 10?
Yes, verses 9 and 10 definitely are connected with sexual sin and punishment in the sexual area.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of lex talionis.
Yes, exactly. And then finally we
I
have
have several places in several passages in Job where children are just are called in parallel columns. In one column as zera, like seed, and in other as tsetsa, like offspring. So I think it's very yeah, like this.
This is why I really don't like the translation that we use in my church, the new RSV, because it always translates zera as offspring, and I think that's the meaning. But you know, seed it's such an important biblical term, and it's it's one that Paul uses, and he makes puns on it almost. So I really think that zera should be translated as seed.
Yes, and this double entendre concerns not only Hebrew texts. For example, as we all know, the first text which mentions Israel is Menentach's Stella, which states that Israel is defeated and his seed is no more. And Egyptologists also dispute what is meant here, that there's no more non-metaphorical seed in Israel, that they are now deemed to die from hunger, or that there are no more offsprings in Israel.
That's
So
interesting.
this is double possibility of understanding the term meaning seed, not only in Hebrew and even not only in Semitic languages, but in other languages as well.
That's interesting.
Yes, but as far as I understand, Masha, your idea, you do not think that Mark is based on some rabbinical tradition like that reflected later in the Targum, rather than the Talmud. Rather than the Talmud is based on Mark, and even not that they are both based on Job, but rather that they are both based on some exegetical or rhetorical tradition or pattern that goes back to Job.
I'm afraid I don't have definite position yet. Sorry.
Окей. Но это действительно очень интересно, потому что в комментариях к этому месту Марка действительно мы встречаем сравнение с трактатом Нидда, вот, но идея, что они могут независимо так или иначе непосредственно или опосредованно восходить к этому месту Иова, она очень красивая и как-то решает здесь вопрос о зависимости. Здорово. Прекрасно, Маша. Очень красивые мысли. Да. Окей, я тогда снова вывожу на экран нашу диглотту. Что-то где же мы? Где?
So finally, we agreed with Adela that whole passage speaks about sexual abuse.
No, we agreed with Adela that verses 43 through 47 deal
Yeah.
with sexual abuse. But it's not completely clear that the previous verses deal with sexual abuse.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay?
It's a collection of, ethical exhortations on maybe various subjects.
Yes. That may not necessarily refer to the same thing even in neighboring verses.
Yeah,
Ну что,
I
друзья,
agree. Again, the connection is catchwords. Um,
да. Хорошо. Тогда мне кажется, что мы сделали действительно очень интересную вещь. Спасибо вам, Маша. Это очень действительно красивая вещь. Красивые параллель с Иовом. Тогда, может быть, действительно, здесь сейчас мы пока что на 47 стихе остановимся на сегодня и продолжим следующую встречу 48 стиха.
we're almost finished with this chapter.
Yes,
Maybe we can finish the chapter next week.
maybe.
2 verses.
Окей. Тогда встречаемся через неделю. Thank you, everyone. Спасибо всем.
Спасибо, очень интересно. До
Спасибо.
свидания.
До свидания. Шана Това.
Тода раба. Шана това.
С Новым годом.
До свидания.
До свидания.